Hi, everyone. Good evening in New York. This is Alexa Gantous, and we are in this segment called Ecological Empathy in the Kitchen. For me, this is actually the morning. I am calling in from Tokyo, Japan. And I am originally from Mexico City, but have lived in New York and ended up a little bit semi stranded here when the coronavirus hit. So a little bit of background on myself. I am not your traditional environmentalist. My background is actually in design and business strategy, and I've worked with a lot of brands on business strategy and helping companies communicate both in terms of language and visually. And I've been interested in the environment for my entire life, and I had been observing how it is so common for us to have so many barriers around we have so many barriers around how we engage with the environmental crisis because of the way that we speak about it. Scientists have incredible knowledge about everything that's happening in the world, yet it's very difficult to translate that in a scientific perspective because as humans, we are moved by the stories that we tell ourselves. We are moved by our emotions. As much as we want to think that we are incredibly rational creatures, we are so much more moved by our physical experience and that the more instinctual draw that we have to things. So I decided to apply a lot of my knowledge around human behavior and design research into engaging with the environmental crisis. So I have a couple of projects going on. The first one, which is called Trash Talk Studio, where I have been hosting a lot of conversations at the intersection of mindfulness and the environment, and really helping people to engage with digesting the heaviness of the environmental crisis from a place of like, how can we reframe this? How can we ask better questions and begin to see it as an opportunity? And coronavirus is also one of those crises that makes us have to go through this process of reframing and speaking and thinking about things completely differently. So I think there's a lot of parallels and lessons to be learned here. And the other project that I'm running with two of my really close friends is Literally. And we normally off quarantine times organize dancing trash pickup parties in the streets of New York City. And we were in the midst of expanding that to California when coronavirus hit. So for us, it's also been a really interesting time of like pivoting from online events to offline events. And what stands really true for us is the fact that we are not just a dancing trash pickup party. We are a community, we are a movement, and our mission of connecting people to environmental action stands as strong as it was back then. So what that's looking like, we've been throwing a lot of virtual events for people cleaning their house. We've had another one based around like dancing with plants and celebrating plants. So we've been really working with this idea of like, how can we integrate silliness into this conversation and really prove that being environmentally conscious is not mutually exclusive to having fun. So this is a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. Like, how can we begin to rethink what it means to be empathetic towards the environment? So I'm just going to give you a little run through of what's going to happen right now. So first, I'm going to talk about the idea of empathy as a concept. You know, it's become such a buzzword. We'll get a little bit into that and like how we can begin expanding that towards things that aren't human. You know, like what does that look like? And then we'll talk about this same idea but applied to the kitchen and to food and how we can begin actually applying this in a very practical way. So I'll give you 5 key points of knowledge of like how to think and engage with your food that are super applicable and practical particularly in times of quarantine where we all have so much more time in the kitchen, cooking, doing things that maybe we wouldn't normally do if we were running around our normal lives. And I'll tell you a little bit about what my journey has been like doing this in Japan, in a country where I don't speak the language or I'm not native from here. So there will be a little bit of a story time experience happening. And then we'll wrap it up with a meditation on connecting food to food into the world. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has any questions about anything. I'm super, super happy to answer any of those. So without further ado, empathy. For those of us who are in the business world or in any sort of design world, it's become such a big thing. It's a word that we hear everywhere at every meeting, you know, like how can we be more empathetic, or like, is this actually like serving the user? And we have this obsession around like human-centered design, which is something that has been revolutionary in its own way. It has been incredible and brought incredible innovation to the world. Yet it lacks to take into account the fact that we live within a system that is ecological, and we have so many limitations around how we're thinking about things. So I keep thinking about this idea of like, we design a product that's amazing for a human to use, and it's like comfortable, you can grab it in your hand, you know, like all of this usability is integrated into it, but we're not thinking about where are the materials of this thing coming from, and then like how is the user disposing of it after they're done with it, and like how does that impact not only us but all of the other species around, like whether it's plants, whether it's animals, whether it's the quality of our air and our water. Because at the end of the day, like something that's really important to understand here is that although our modern society has led us to believe that we are separate from nature, we are nature, and everything that we give back to a planet comes back to us. And that is as true when we're giving back something that's nurturing, or when we're taking care of a garden and watering it and like having this very sweet and tender interaction, as it is when we're disposing of chemicals into the atmosphere, or we're disposing of plastics that aren't biodegradable. A fact that just really startles me every time is that most of us are consuming an average of the weight of a credit card of plastic every single week, which is just really wild to think about, no? Because most of us think like, oh, what is one more plastic thing? What is one more wrapper in our food? You know, like, why would I go through that like extra step to find something that's not wrapped in plastic when our world is designed this way? Yet it's really wild to think about the fact that it's coming right back at us. So when we're talking about empathy, we really need to think about like, what does that mean? And what does that mean applied to the three components of connection? What does it mean when it's applied to myself? What does it mean when it's applied to others? And then what does it mean when it's applied to the planet? How can we actually begin to become so much more attuned and sensitive to the experience of the world outside of us? And I know this sounds like really, really crazy and abstract to some, but it's all the same. The choices that we make for our health and the choices that we make for the planet are all one and the same. Like, there's this incredible quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer in this beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass that says, when we work to heal the earth heals us. And it's something that has really, really become more true and resonant with me as we've been navigating this corona crisis, you know, this idea of like what it means to be healthy and what it means to be sick. And there's so much happening right now with human health and so many conversations around the systems of healthcare worldwide. Yet I think something that's really missing from that conversation is how can we expect to be healthy in a planet that's sick? And that's not to take away from the darkness of the times that we're living in and the really hard lessons that we're learning, but we're seeing all of these environmental policies being rolled back in the midst of coronavirus, and I just can't help but thinking, is this the response? Is going ahead and contaminating our water and polluting the air the right response to a health crisis? You know, how is making our planet sicker an intuitive response to a global pandemic? How will that save us from the next pandemic? So when it comes to the idea of empathy applied to ecology, I think what's really missing is this idea of we are one. How can we begin to create a system beyond human-centered design? How can we really begin to create a system where we all win, including other species? And I think a lot about this idea of like, what does interspecies collaboration look like? Because the more biodiversity there is, the healthier the planet will be. You know, like killing all life on Earth is doing a favor to no one. Yeah, so I know this is all very theoretical and abstract and maybe a lot to grasp for some of us. So I'm going to take it into this idea of like ecological empathy in the kitchen and how it applies to food so that we can begin to narrow it down into something that we can actually begin to interact with. So food is a basic human need. It's something that we all share and that we all have in common, no matter who we are, where we're from. Food transcends cultures, it transcends borders, it transcends gender, it transcends whatever we can think of. We all have to eat. And it's also something that has an incredible power to bring us together as humans, as families, as friends, as communities. Most of us gather around food. You know, when I think about what I miss the most about quarantine is actually inviting friends over for dinner or ending up in like these really, really long dinners with friends or with family. And I'm from Mexico originally, so that's a really big thing for us, you know, like not only gathering around food, but just like gathering around the table and spending hours sharing stories around the table, but it's all centered around, you know, like this food. And in Mexico, it's tacos and guacamole and all of these dishes that are very tied to the Mexican soil and the Mexican land, you know, like all the spices. And now that I'm in Japan, like it's a completely different culture around food where it's whatever grows here, you know, it's the rice and the ginger and the noodles and just completely different flavors, but it's equally as profound and telling of a place. So food connects us to one another so deeply and so profoundly. Yet, because of how disconnected modern society is from nature, we don't really think about how deeply it connects us to the earth as well. You know, think about it. We go to the supermarket and just buy whatever we need off the shelves. And we don't really think like where that thing came from, you know, like it came from the supermarket. You know, most of us don't really like pause and think about like, where was this grown? Where is it coming from? You know, how many people touched this? How many people were involved in like making this one item be in the supermarket so that I could buy it? And I think that's really mind blowing if we like really, really take a step back and begin to like zoom out and understand the entire system of how this thing came to be. And particularly in a globalized world, because we suddenly don't only have the things that are grown there, but then we have things that are coming from all over the world, all the time, every season, and it can be the middle of winter and we can have tomatoes, and that's so crazy to think about. So food is something that like connects us in a way that's way deeper than we normally think about. And I think that's really, it's something to like, we should let it sink in for a little bit. Like, what does that mean? Yeah. And a little bit of a story around this. I grew up in Mexico. So Mexico City in particular doesn't really have seasons. It's a place that's like pretty much the same weather all year round. So it wasn't until I moved to Denmark and later to New York where I really got to experience a very drastic change of seasons, of going to fall into winter into spring into summer. And I really started to get attuned to the fact that, oh, food is seasonal as well. Like different things grow at different times of the year. And like, I think that's something that is very hard to grasp for someone that comes from a country that has such rich soil and weather all the time, because what grows and doesn't grow, and like those subtleties are a lot less obvious than in a place where in New York and in modern society today, like it's not obvious at all, because you go to the supermarket and there's everything all the time that's being like shipped from Chile and from China and from Mexico, and it's just this like wild web of interconnection. And the more I started like really, really understanding seasonality, and like this was way later in my life, like I was already in my early 20s when like this hit me, and I was really mind blown. And at the same time, I was going through this journey of beginning to like understand waste and what that meant for me. So I ended up like learning so much about food through exploring waste, which is really, really interesting. Because trying to avoid plastic in the supermarket led me to going to a farmer's market where I could see exactly like what was grown locally, which automatically meant seasonally. And that was a really, really interesting moment in my life, because not only was I learning so much, like I could feel it in my body when I started eating locally and in season and fresh produce that wasn't wrapped in plastic. Like my relationship to taste completely changed. Suddenly I was able to understand like why we shouldn't eat tomatoes in winter. It makes no sense. They don't taste good when you compare it to like a fresh tomato in the summer. Like it just made me question like, is this even worth it? And being attuned to that just completely changed my life. And then I started understanding the greater picture aside from like how good it made me feel and my body feel. And I started understanding that it also hurts the land when we do that, when we attempt to grow tomatoes in the middle of winter. And when we don't respect the natural cycles of what's happening. And soil really is the foundation of all life. Good quality of soil makes our food so much more nutritious. And this is science. The healthier the soil is, the more nutrients are in our food. So when we talk about eating from an agricultural system that is not respecting the land, then we're also not respecting our bodies. because we're not getting the nutrients that we should be getting from the food that we're eating. So when I talk about ecological empathy, particularly in terms of food, it means really being attuned to not only like what is healthier for the planet, but what is healthier for me. Because at the end of the day, like those two things become completely interchangeable, which is truly incredible to think about. I'm just checking the comments to see if anyone has any dying questions. I miss sharing the meals with friends for sure. Me too. Dinner is my favorite time of day. Oh my god, I'll tell you a little bit of story about that one. My parents still make so much fun of me. When I was a kid in kindergarten, we had one of those school activities where they make you write like, what's your favorite color and like what's your favorite seed, like what's your favorite animal, la la la. And one of the questions was, what's your favorite subject? And I answered lunch. And my parents still can't get over it. And the funniest part is that it's so true. Up to this day, my favorite subject is still lunch. Maybe breakfast is in there as well. So in terms of applying ecological empathy in the kitchen, I'm going to give you my 5 golden tips, and we've already touched upon a few of these. So the first one is seasonality is everything. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible and revolutionary to start understanding what grows when, and like in some places, obviously it's still a mystery for me and I have no idea. And I spend so much time like trying to do research. But normally if you have access to a farmer's market, that changes everything. And even better, a lot of people don't know about the existence of CSAs, but there's a lot of programs everywhere in the world where you can actually buy boxes of produce from a farm, where like every week or every month they'll ship you a box of everything that they've grown and that they have fresh. And it's absolutely revolutionary because like you know who you're getting your food from, and you almost like begin to develop that relationship with the farm and the farmer that's growing your food. And you're inevitably eating seasonally and you're inevitably eating locally, which is absolutely incredible. So I highly recommend. And I had been really, really struggling in Japan because they love plastic, love plastic. And I actually brought some of it to show you. I didn't bring all of my kitchen, but everything is wrapped, even things that just shouldn't be wrapped and that have natural packaging. And then suddenly I went from like having lived this like pretty minimal waste, like at some points even zero waste life, to like every week the kitchen, like taking the trash out was like, what a nightmare. And then at some point I just like, when I realized I was going to end up staying in Japan way longer than I expected, I had to have a talk with my boyfriend and be like, we need to figure out another solution. So we started up like looking up farms and like all of these things. And like, luckily he speaks Japanese because most things in Japan aren't translated to English. And we found this incredible local farm that we've been buying produce with. And they send us everything in recycled newspaper. And it's absolutely zero waste and delicious. And I also brought some of these to show you, these little kale leaves that have been incredible. And we keep them in these little bowls with water, and they're so fresh and so tasty. And we're just so much happier with what we're eating. And we automatically have to get so much more creative in the kitchen and learn new recipes, because we don't fall into that pattern of like, when you're going to a supermarket and just like end up buying the same thing, like suddenly we're having to work with all of these unexpected new ingredients. And it's just been brought so much more joy into our eating lives and our bodies and our stomachs. Um, so then very, very tied to that first one, the second golden rule is eating locally. And if you are going like full CSA, buying from a local farmer, then inevitably your food is local. And what's really magical about this is that, that they say that when you go to a place for the first time, the best thing that you can do is eat local honey. Oh, what is my favorite new Japanese discovery? Oof, bamboo. I am obsessed with bamboo root. Bamboo already was one of my favorite materials ever for like building things, like I use a bamboo toothbrush, and it's just like the thing that keeps on giving. Bamboo is a little bit of a plague, so it grows really, really fast and in abundance, and it's super biodegradable. And I also have been discovering it's delicious. I learned how to make this incredible bamboo rice dish, and I'm just absolutely mind blown with it. um, and then, okay, I'm going to address this other question and we'll keep going. So, growing up in Mexico, what was the messaging like about ecology and environmentalism? So, that's an interesting one because I grew up in Mexico City, which is a city of 22 million people. I was in no way really connected to nature in the same way that I am now. Like, that has really been a process of me getting rid of so much of the societal conditioning that I had. Yet, I think I always felt very, very attuned to this idea that I was missing nature. I think like being in such a metropolitan and urban city, I personally always had this sense of like craving for something that I didn't have. And I didn't really know what it was for many, many years. And, like I went from there to New York, which is also another huge city. And like now I find myself in Tokyo. But through that journey of like not having, I have found like the importance of it. It's a little bit like what we talk about with health nowadays with coronavirus. Like you don't really appreciate your health until you don't have it. And I guess it was a case of that where I was like, I didn't really have a lot of nature. But then I started understanding that we don't need to be in nature surrounded by trees to feel connected to it. Because if we like really, really sit down to think about it, everything around us is nature. Like the computers or the phones that we're looking at this from, or the places and the spaces that we're sitting, they're all transformations of nature. And some of them have less of an impact than others. Some are a little bit more conscious than others, but at the end of the day, it's all nature, which is crazy. Okay, so I'm going to finish with these tips for applied ecological empathy in the kitchen, and then I'll answer a few more questions. And then the third one, which is, my personal obsession, is looking at packaging and waste. So I think I mentioned before that I went on a little bit of a zero waste journey, and I'm not a zero waste advocate. I think it's like reaching for that standard of perfection can sometimes be a little bit more of a hassle than it is helpful. Yet I think there's so much magic in the process of discovery and the change of consciousness of starting to notice things like this. One of my favorite ideas ever that I learned from design school is that limitations are the mother of creativity. And I find it to be so true for everything, including our own lives. And the moment where I was like, okay, I'm going to try to like really, really reduce my plastic packaging and like my consumption of unnecessary single-use materials, everything changed. Like obviously it's not an easy journey, and like you start realizing like how dependent we are on plastic and single-use materials, especially in a city like New York, which is based on convenience and having this lifestyle of like go, 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 and everything has to be fast. I was definitely like in a very fast-paced city, like really going against the status quo by living a slower life where I was taking the time to make a lot of my own products and really learn so much about cooking because I was having to spend so much more time making my own meals and really interacting with these new ingredients. And it was a long process. It wasn't like I did it overnight and like suddenly I wasn't using any plastic. But I just found so much space for creativity and innovation. And it honestly is absolutely revolutionary what you end up finding and the way in which it changes your mind. Um, you just begin seeing absolutely everything, including yourself, in a new way. And I really believe there's nothing as inspiring as having an experience like that. So when it comes to food in particularly, it almost becomes like an unintentional diet. My body changed so much when I stopped buying so many packaged things because I automatically wasn't eating any processed foods anymore. Um, so yeah, I won't say that much more about that, but I highly recommend like trying it within the measure of possibility. Sometimes it's harder than others, like avoiding packaging or having access to that even. Like I understand that for many it can actually be a privilege to avoid packaging in the first place. Um, but yeah, if you are in a position where it's something that could potentially be available for you, and again, like a CSA farm box is an amazing way to start. I highly, highly recommend taking that extra step and just like beginning to like play around with like what might this feel like or like what could it be. And then the other one is thinking about organic. So this one's a really interesting one because I deeply, deeply believe that it's one of the best ways to heal the land. And it's a controversial one because, again, like speaking about privilege, buying organic for a lot of people can be just out of the budget and completely impossible. And like even those of us who like could potentially afford it, like you see something that's conventional and it's so much more cheaper than buying organic, and it's like why would I make this choice, like why would I buy organic? And I think something funny to point out there is the fact that like why do we call pesticide crops conventional? How is that normal, putting chemicals on our food that are hurting farm workers and those chemicals that are hurting our bodies? So that's definitely something to ponder on. And there's a lot of different types of organics. There's industrial agriculture, organic farms, which aren't necessarily as good as small farm organics. So there's a lot of things to look at in there, but I highly, highly recommend that if it is something that you can do, buying organic is completely revolutionary, particularly when you're buying things where you will be eating the skin, like berries or apples or kale or greens. In general, buying organic is so much better because you're like actually eating the thing and are at a higher risk of actually consuming that pesticide than if you're buying something that like has a skin protection and you're only eating the inside. So I think that's a really good golden rule to live by. And the fifth golden rule is, does it spark joy for you? And I've been really, really recently re-obsessed with this idea of Mary Kondo, but I think it's so, so true. And like exactly as I was saying, of like my boyfriend and I's excitements of like getting our farm produce and like being able to like play with all of these new ingredients, like the amount of joy that sparked for us is incredible, and so much more than like buying something that's in plastic in the supermarket and we're buying the same thing, la la la. So like follow that gut instinct of like really, really questioning of like, am I going to go the convenient, easy route? Or am I actually gonna like want to be delighted by this? So yeah, a golden rule to live by, not only with food, but I think for everything in our lives. It's a good reminder. Okay. Okay, so someone's asking, why doesn't bamboo have more widespread use, or does it? So the thing with bamboo is it has been more widely used for a few things, but I would say that the biggest limitation is actually an economical one due to the fact that plastic is so cheap. So it's very hard for other materials to compete with something that's highly, highly subsidized by oil. I don't know if you know this, but plastics are made from oil and fossil fuels. So the plastics industry has been very subsidized by our use of oil, and it makes it a very, very tricky industry to compete against in economical terms. That's why also plastic recycling isn't very effective, because virgin plastic is super, super cheap. And there's other problems with recycling that I won't get into that rabbit hole too deeply. So how do we stop chain reaction if we don't start from the top? So I think that this is one of those problems where everything counts. Absolutely everything that we can do has an impact. And I think we have so much more power as individuals than we realize. I really believe, particularly now, we live in a world where companies are listening now more than ever to the data of where customers are spending their money. So if people are refusing to buy plastic, if people are refusing to buy things that are made from materials that are harmful to the environment or that are super toxic and chemical, then that shift will happen a lot faster. And I think it's already happening very, very slowly. But I think the more of us that are willing to like take that extra step of like going against what's easier, against what is convenient, the more companies will listen. And I think this is something that like needs to happen at every single level. It's not just something that falls on the consumer or on the individual. And I think for those of us who are in the business world or entrepreneurs or in the design world or creators, that's something that where we can go an extra step and influence culture or business by showing up in that way in the world, and really challenging decisions that would be considered business as usual. And it's a process, but I think it takes all of us. And yeah, I think the most dangerous thing is staying in a mentality where we think a single person doesn't make a difference, because I really think it does. So how do we get better at educating the public? So this is one that I've thought about quite a lot. And I think the best way to start is actually by changing ourselves and embodying that as fully as we can. I think it's quite ineffective for us to go around trying to change other people. And I think there's a lot of people who are already really, really interested in having someone around their lives or their circles, or even like on Instagram, where they're like, oh, like this person is doing it, like, oh, I can also do that, is incredibly inspiring. So I think more than like trying to change something that's external, I think the more we do it from ourselves and create that around us, the more we can influence people. And I think it really is something where I always think about two things, like how can we inspire and how can we empower? And I think that's the most incredible formula for onboarding people in a way that feels authentic and where we're also allowing them to have their own journey of discovery of what it means to engage in the world in this very, very different way. And I think there's really no right and wrong. And it's not like you're an environmentalist or you're not. It really is a spectrum of learning and going deeper into the journey and understanding. It's almost like a spiritual path. Mm. Yes. So someone's saying here in the comments, I think the problem is we don't know who to trust because everyone says different things like organic, not organic, whole grain, not whole grain. There's so much mixed messaging and no regulations on what on what we can label, and the general public just doesn't know what to trust. I completely agree. I think messaging around all of this is very, very confusing. And it's one of those things where we kind of need to take the power back onto our own hands and really, really understand what works for us. And I believe that in a process of experimentation where we test out different things. If you're really interested in learning more about food in particular, I really recommend looking into Michael Pollan. He has some incredible, incredible books and podcasts and all sorts of resources that really speak about a journey of discovering and understanding food on a much deeper level. So that would be a place where I would start. And then Justine is asking, I didn't realize that plastic production is subsidized by oil. Can you elaborate? Yes, so indeed, plastic is made from oil, which is so crazy to think about. I think I didn't really I think I knew, but I didn't fully know until a few years ago, and I was so mind blown. So yeah, a lot of, I think it's a pretty high percentage of the total oil production of the world that is going directly into plastic production. And that is why it's absolutely everywhere. And it's something that boomed at the same time as the chemical industry right after World War II. So we only have 1 minute left. So I want to finish this off with a little meditation to leave us all in a more serene, grounded place after all of this information bombing. And Justine, I'm very happy to go into this talk later. Oh, that's a great question. What does it mean that oil just traded negative on the market then? I do not know how to respond to that question right now, but I will definitely do some research and we can continue talking about it. So I invite everyone to start with a deep, deep breath. Take a deep inhale and exhale. Close your eyes. Take another inhale and exhale. Let go of any tension you might be holding on your shoulders, your jaw. Keep breathing. Make sure you're upright, spine straight. Take another deep breath in and exhale. And with that, begin to contemplate how every single breath that you take is coming from the oceans and from the forests. And no matter how far away you are from nature, nature is taking care of you. It doesn't matter if you're right by the beach or in your New York apartment or in the middle of nowhere. You belong to nature. And with every sunrise and every sunset, The sun is taking care of us. It's providing us with endless beauty, but the sun is also warming the earth to a temperature that makes it comfortable for us to live. It's feeding the plants so that the plants can feed us. And the soil is nourishing those plants so that we can eat them and digest them and get some of that sun energy as well. And every night the moon comes out and regulates the tides. And it's crazy to think that as separate as we might perceive ourselves from the natural world, we are inherently and invisibly interconnected to absolutely everything. And there's nothing as true as the fact that we are what we eat. So the more empathy that we're showing to our food and really understanding and cultivating a relationship where that food is coming from and how the land there is treated and how the vegetables are treated, then the more we can begin to heal that relationship and heal ourselves. Take another deep breath in, another deep breath out. And just continue in this realization and this sense of incredible wonder by the fact that the world is taking care of us and we should be taking care of it back. When you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out. The easiest way to contact me is through Instagram, Alexa Gantous. You can see my name on the screen. My handle is exactly the same. And if you're interested in knowing more about Literally, follow us at Literally_, and that's TRRL. And you can also find that in my profile. It was such a pleasure being here on Stimulus TV. Thank you, Justine, for putting this together, and the entire team for making this happen.